28 Pittsburgh Street in Columbiana, Ohio, the nicest town in America. Is it? Is that what it's called? Nicest town? Nicest place? Nicest place in America? Here we are, right in the heart of it. Heartland. In the heartland of America, in the heart of the nicest place in America. Isn't that something? What an appropriate name for where we dwell at this moment. All right, we are talking about Harry S. Truman. And as Mr. Schwendeman, I thought he was like trying to pull something on me yesterday. I'm like, what? What's the S stand for in Harry S. Truman? What is it? Anybody? What does the S stand for in Harry S. Truman? You know how some of these presidents are known by their first and middle initial, and then other ones aren't, right? Like Ronald Reagan. Nobody says Ronald W. Reagan. You guys all know his middle name, right? I've said it enough. Wilson, right? So nobody, some we do, some we don't. What's the S stand for in Harry S. Truman? I'll give you a hint. It's the same thing the S stands for in our previous president, Ulysses S. Grant. Yes. Nothing. It's just gotta, hey, you're president. You gotta have that middle initial. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Right? For whatever reason, some people think that adds status to you. What's your middle initial? Would that raise your status?
Yes, 100%.
You should just start. Yeah.
I was named that. My middle name is Reagan, like after Ronald Reagan.
Woo! Verity Reagan Osborne. You only hear that like at graduation or something, huh?
What is this?
All right, let's roll. Speaking of Harry Truman and his second term, shouldn't that be Alvin Barkley? Did you catch that in the video?
What is it?
It says Albert. It should be Alvin. The election of 1948. What was the iconic moment of the election of 1948? Surely you remember. We had the video yesterday. You got the visual of it. What was do you know what the word iconic means? It's like the big moment that everybody remembers and goes on to live. Famously, what is that moment of the 1948 election, Scott? The big headline in one of the major newspapers of the country, Dewey defeats Truman. It was a foregone conclusion that Dewey was going to beat Truman. Because look, Truman's a Democrat, and you've got all these people in the South that are rising up against him because he had the audacity to desegregate the American army. How dare you try to make it as a federal mandate that blacks and whites must serve together in the military? And you know that that's unfortunately how a lot of people in America were, especially in the South, all the way through the 1950s into the 60s. Sadly, you know that even though there's far fewer of them, there's still people in America that think like that. So these people in the South that were still controlling things, like you learned about in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and how they were living in the 30s and being treated as if they were still slaves, and the Logans that owned their land were like, they were really coming after them because they had the audacity to own their own land. That's how these people fought, by and large, in places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. So they formed their own party. And they got nicknamed the Dixiecrats. And they ran their own candidate. And we found out in the video yesterday that he got like 3% of the vote. That should have defeated Truman. That's why there was no way he was going to win. There was another candidate splitting up the Democratic vote. The Republicans had the governor of New York teamed up with the governor of what other state? California. Governor Warren. I mean, how could they lose? You got the Democrats in disarray. You got the Republicans that got both coasts taken care of, or did they? Did you notice the map yesterday? Guess what state the Democrats won? California. Even though, I mean, that's rare. That's like really, really rare. The whole idea, Verity, behind presidential politics is I'm going to pick a running mate, a vice president that's going to give me clout in a state that maybe it's up in the air. But of course, the people of that state are going to vote for their guy. That plays a lot into it. You don't just pick a vice president because, hey, I like him, he's my friend, or he agrees with me on everything in politics. Sometimes you pick a vice president that doesn't necessarily agree with you on everything, but he's from a state that maybe would be key, or a region that would be key to helping you win. Does that make sense? Everybody get that? Okay. Or demographic. You know what that word means? So like in the most recent election, it wasn't necessarily about regional politics. It was about demographic politics. It was about social politics. Because it was stated beforehand, who's going to be the vice president. There wasn't a name connected to the vice presidency yet in 2020, but there was this is what's going to happen. It's going to be a female, black female. You didn't catch that before it happened? It wasn't just that Kamala Harris happened to be, maybe or maybe not the most qualified person to be vice president, but it was stated from the beginning who are you going to pick? Hey, are you going to pick someone from Texas? Because Texas, hey, if the Democrats win Texas, it's game over, right? They already got California in the bag. They already got New York in the bag. This is these days, right? If you get Texas, game over. Doesn't matter what the Republicans do or any party. If one party wins New York, California, and Texas, you can just say it's over. So maybe Biden picks someone from Texas. And what if they would win Texas? But in this case, the overwhelming political climate said, because the situation we're in right now that you're growing up in, this social upheaval that we're living through, the overwhelming consensus was no, it doesn't have to be a regional candidate. It has to be someone that fits, that checks the politically correct boxes. So female and black, and that's how we got Kamala Harris as vice president. And unfortunately, that's being displayed all over the world as we go through this crisis that's going on in Ukraine. Did I just say unfortunately? To all the world? So you watched the video yesterday, right? And that brings us to the fair deal. You did that too? Mm-hmm. And NATO? Yes. With the proper capitalization of everything now. And a little, listen, subtle at first. Hey, you notice in 1950, all those women that went to work during the war in the 40s, more of them stayed this time. After World War I, most of them went back to traditionally what women do. This time, most of them still did that, but way more of them stayed in the workplace this time. How's that going to change? Speaking of demographics, how's that going to change American society going forward to the rest of the 20th century? We talked about the Korean War? Nothing yet? Oh boy. Okay, the Korean War. Oh, I'm sorry. The Korean conflict. Wait, what was it? Why do some people want to argue and say it wasn't the Korean War? They want to say, technically, it's the Korean conflict. Why do you think? Come on, think. Put your logic hats on and tell me why some people insist that we are wrong for calling it the Korean War. Yeah, we didn't declare war. Does that make sense, Dina? I mean, hey, why would you call it a war when we didn't declare war? Well, because it was a war. See what I'm saying, Caleb? So legally, we did not declare to the world we are at war against anyone. As a matter of fact, we were at war against the North Koreans and their sponsors, the Russians, in this battle of ideas called communism and freedom, capitalism. So there was a war. But just know that. Just know that in the future, you might come across some smarty pants that says, oh, that wasn't a war, it was just a conflict. Just agree and say, oh, yeah, I get it. They were at war, but it wasn't legally a war. Oh, by the way, who's the commies? The North. Someone asked me yesterday, because of the political culture that you're growing up in, like, hey, what are you allowed to say? What are you not allowed to say? Someone asked me, and they were serious, I think. They're like, are you allowed to call them commies? You know what I mean? Like, we have warned you before, you don't say a, you say Arabs, right? That's got a negative connotation. If you say a, and then Rabs after, people take that wrong. By now, you know that, black's acceptable, African American is acceptable, but really nothing else is acceptable. Japanese, I don't know if one of the headlines in one of the videos we saw, I think it might have been on the newspaper, it said JAPS, right? That was kind of a common thing, and now if you say that, it's taken as a insult, so we don't talk like that. So they were wondering, like, are we supposed to be careful? And I'm like, absolutely not. There's a big difference between saying something that is offensive to people because of the pigment of their skin or where they were born, something that is like natural part of their biology, right? There's a big difference in making fun of that and making fun of them supporting some evil system of government that has caused death and destruction to hundreds of millions of people just in the last 100-some years. Feel free to call them commies, because I do, because that's something that we should be standing against and not worried about insulting someone. Does that make sense? Is that the Christian thing to do? You guys just look at me. I don't know if you think it is or not. Is it okay to call them commies, Casey?
Yeah.
Does that mean spirited?
No.
Anyway, the North, just like we're going to find out in Vietnam, it's the North against the South. It's the North, they're the communists that are trying to impose their way of life on the rest of the world. Someone asked a question in second period. Well, they asked it after we watched the video, which we'll see in a second. As you're writing that, the question was proposed, really? They were trying to dominate the world? Yes! The whole point to Marxist socialism / communism is they believe that this should be a worldwide revolution. And they won't stop until they achieve it. Who's they? Well, if you go back to this period of time, it's the Soviet Union and their idea behind Joseph Stalin, following the teachings of Karl Marx and the Bolshevik way of implementing that system, that's the way it should be for all the world. And by the way, it's better if it's that way for all the world if I'm in charge, if you're Joseph Stalin. Because I've got the power to implement this system. Goes back to Animal Farm that you read with Mr. Lamb. All pigs are equal, just that some pigs are more equal than others. Say it's a great system because everybody's equal, John. The only problem is, no, it's not. Because not everybody's equal. Because every time this has been tried through history where we're going to say kumbaya and everybody's equal, guess what happens? No, they're not equal. You've got a group of elite people that garner all the benefits of this spreading the wealth and equality, and everybody else is left with crumbs. That's just the way of it. That's the way it is. Make sense, Caleb? And that's why we Americans, we who believe in the American way, have to strongly stand against. And you, going a couple years into your college years and faced with hopefully it changes quickly, but presently kind of overwhelming sentiment in the college arena that it's actually a good thing again. Every time we think we've stamped out this wretched idea, it rises again. And right now, you're growing up in a time where it has to be stamped out again, unless you're unwilling to do it. Thankfully, we've had previous generations that have been willing to like literally put their lives on the line to stamp it out again, because it's like cyclical. Going back to Karl Marx in the mid 1800s, spreading this idea of global revolution in the name of everybody being equal. There will be no more haves and have-nots, and it's easy to sell because who isn't touched by the idea that there's have-nots? I know I am. So the solution is that we'll make sure nobody has more than anybody else. Everybody's needs will be met. It's going to tug at your heartstrings at some point. And if you're so open-minded because you're not set in your beliefs that you will be easily and gullibly led by a professor that will lay it out for you to make it as if you're not even Christian if you don't follow the teachings of communism, you'll get sucked into it because it's very easy to do. If I was to put on that hat and come in here every day and espouse those things, I would lay it out for you that you'd start to feel a little bit inferior to me morally and every way else if you didn't agree with communism. That's how it would be and is taught. You not only feel intellectually inferior, you are made to feel morally inferior if you don't buy socialism/communism. Because what kind of person are you that you don't agree that everybody's needs should be met? And what kind of person are you that you don't see the greed that capitalism brings? These business owners and these multi-billionaires. While we're here barely getting by. Many Americans living paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, you got these people making billions of dollars. Is that fair? What's wrong with you? I'm already changing some of your minds, and I'm telling you beforehand. I'm looking at your faces like, yeah, you're right. You got to think things through. You got to look at history and what has happened when this has been tried. But listen, here's what they'll tell you. It isn't that communism's bad. They were bad communists. Get the difference, right? Do you understand what that means? Communism isn't bad. It was that they were bad communists. They weren't doing it right. We're going to do it right this time. By the way, there's this little thing called freedom. May or may not be important to you. It was important enough that I used to know this number. How many millions of people died to protect it so you can be who you are and who you want to be? Anyway, we gave all that sermon while you're writing those notes to tell you that this is a very important issue post-World War II because you've got this idea that truly does want to dominate the world, global communism, and they are spreading. And that's why we had the Truman Doctrine that said anywhere in the world that needs our help to stop the spread of this evil system, we will be there because we know what it's going to do to the people of that society. Oh, by the way, so I'll wrap this up with this. Ask the people of Ukraine where they stand. So if someone in Ukraine is my age, 30 years ago, when they were already an adult, they were freed from the yoke of the Soviet Union after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, right? So here they are, my age. They've experienced the first 26 years of their life living under the oppressive communist government of the Soviet Union. Now, for the last 30 years, they've been enjoying growing in the idea of being free people. They want to be part of NATO. They want to be part of the Western world. And they know the difference so well that they're not fleeing to Poland or Romania. They're in their homes right now. And if anyone tries to, they're ready to fight and die to preserve the difference. They know the difference. You understand what I'm saying? For not just their own freedom, but for their children and grandchildren. They're willing to stay there and fight with they're like, it'd be like, I don't know, Latonia playing state champion, the biggest St. Edwards or something, football, right? They really don't have a chance, right? It's 3 weeks, but they're staying and fighting. Why would you fight if you don't have a chance? There must be something really, really, really
important and true that you know that would motivate you to stay against all odds and fight for that? What are they fighting for? Freedom. They know the difference between living under oppressive communist government and living in freedom. And thankfully, we've had people that come before us for 240 years that were willing to do the same thing. My only regret is that I've got one life to give for my country. Give me liberty or give me death. And then the millions that have come in between up to this point. We talked yesterday about what would it be like in America? How many Americans would fight for this precious thing that we take for granted called freedom? You got all that? Guess who got fired? See that? Very famous, successful General Douglas MacArthur, on the heels of the great victory against Japan, and now he gets called into duty because the communists in the North have driven, by the way, the 38th parallel. If you don't know where Korea is this. Here's Japan, right across the Sea of Japan is the Korean Peninsula. You got north and south, and almost right down the middle of that, here, this line of latitude is 40. So that's why it's called the 38th parallel. Remember, you learned that longitude were meridians and latitude was parallels. So it's the 38th parallel that separates north and south. So all you got to do is be between those two lines, and there's like a couple miles right now as we speak of a place where the north's on that side of the fence, the south's on this side of the fence, and in the middle is kind of like no man's land, not like World War I no man's land. Nobody's really fighting there, but the south's defending this side of it, the north's defending that side of it, and there's been a stalemate for the last 70 years. The Korean War, first of all, you're going to get people that are being persnickety and say, well, it wasn't really a war, it was a conflict because we never declared war. And then you'll get people that are being persnickety and they'll go, the Korean War didn't end in 1953. It's still going because there was no armistice. There was no treaty signed. They just got together and called a ceasefire because they reached a stalemate after the North pushed the South. They almost took over the whole South Korean peninsula. General MacArthur comes in, says, not so fast, my friend. Drives them all the way back across 38th parallel. China, who sympathizes with the North Koreans, right? Because China's soon to have a revolution. They're going to go totally red. By the way, red, communist color. They come in. They've also got the backing of Soviet Union, because that's what this is, right? We're 1950. It's all been set up. The United States, the beacon of freedom. Countries line up behind the United States, or the United States tries to maintain influence in as many countries as they can. Soviet Union, the threat of, instead of the beacon of, the threat of oppressive government. And the Soviet Union getting influence and control as many of those countries as they can. Well, the Soviet Union is backing the communists, of course, in the North. And America then has to come, Truman Doctrine has to come, because the people of the South are like, no, we don't want this. So we drive them back. China comes in, drives us back across the 38th parallel with the help of Russia and China. And then we drive them back, and then we reach this stalemate. And the video will help. Oops. Well, before we get to the video, the unfortunate thing is, even though we reached a stalemate, there's still a lot of fighting going on along that border that's now called the demilitarized zone. And we end up 40,000 U.S. soldiers die. 100,000 are wounded. Anybody ever see a TV show that starts something like this? Da, 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 da. It's on the old channels now. It's called MASH. Raise your hand if you ever heard of it. You just gave a look like you don't really like that show.
Oh, it's my dad too.
Yeah. MASH was set during the Korean War. I kind of have mixed feelings about MASH because the fact that it's like historical fiction, it's set in the war, there really is some good comedy in there. But when I was your age, we only had 3 channels, right? And the parents controlled all the stuff that was on TV. And there was a point where every day my dad and I'd hear that music come on. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. But I kind of like it, so I got that mixed feeling about it. So this guy, like always, I tell you, I try to find a video that you won't be thinking that you're listening to some really boring college professor, and you won't be getting something that like a third grader would have, and it won't be 20 minutes long. It'll be long. So this is what this is the one I settled on for this. Nope, not Liberty Bibberty.
In the wake of the Second World War, the United States and Soviet Union emerged as two global superpowers, each one with a very different idea of what a society should look like. The battle between communism and capitalism would continue for decades, but first boiled over in the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. To better understand the conflict, here are 5 facts you need to know about the Korean War. The first step in understanding the Korean War is to learn the geography. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the United States took control of the southern half of Korea, while the Soviet Union took the north. They were divided by the 38th parallel, a horizontal line that split the peninsula in two. Wasn't it the poet Robert Frost who said good fences make good neighbors? Well, in this case, he would have been wrong. North and South Korea were not too keen on accepting the new line drawn in the sand, and skirmishes between the new neighbors often flared up along the border. The United States and President Truman were deeply concerned with the spread of communism. We are united in detesting communist slavery, which they viewed as a direct threat to American democracy. Truman also wanted to prevent Russia from gaining any more territory and believed communist North Korea was the Russians' first step towards world domination. Therefore, he believed he had no choice but to stop the North Korean army after they invaded the South in June of 1950. At first, North Korean forces were victorious, driving South Korean and U.S. troops nearly out of the country by August. But with the help of the United Nations, the U.S. forces resupplied and rallied, recapturing the South Korean capital Seoul in September and crossing the 38th parallel the month after. Korea was a country with freezing winters and broiling summers, making the actual combat miserable for both sides. Disease, malnutrition, and frostbite were constant worries. General Douglas MacArthur believed a total victory was the only acceptable outcome for the U.S. President Truman disagreed, but MacArthur was adamant, and after he was caught privately lobbying his views in Congress, Truman relieved him of duty for his insubordination. While all this was going down, North Korean forces had driven the UN troops back to the 38th parallel, and by May of 1951, the armies were more or less at a stalemate. For the next 2 years, neither side gained any significant ground, although fighting did continue both on land and in the air. Peace talks started in the summer of 1951, shortly after the start of the stalemate. Negotiations threatened to drag on even longer until President Dwight Eisenhower took office in 1953. Eisenhower was determined to end the war. Joseph Stalin, who wanted to keep the war going, died in March of that year. After a few months more of negotiation, the armistice was signed in July, ending the 3+ year slog of fighting. The Korean War was a relatively short but costly conflict. 36,000 U.S. troops were killed, with over 100,000 wounded. 620,000 soldiers from North and South Korea were killed, but more disturbingly, 1.6 million civilians lost their lives throughout the Korean Peninsula. The 38th parallel still divides the two Koreas today, serving as a demilitarized zone. 4,400 yards of empty space separates the two countries, whose borders are defended by armed troops 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
I think I earlier said I meant no peace treaty, not no armistice. The difference being armistice says, okay, we're going to cease fire. Treaty says the war is over and this is the conditions of the end of the war. So my apologies for that. Questions, comments? No questions, comments? Curiosities? Thankful for those of you that, for the chapel speaker, like, raised your hand for a couple questions. Every time there's a chapel speaker and they start trying to interact with the student body, I'm like, oh no, please, somebody. And I'm also thinking, welcome to my world. This is what I got to deal with. So hopefully, like, you start to get this sense of, you know what, this person's investing all this time. Even if I don't really want to participate, I'm going to participate, try to help that person feel better. Anyway, any questions, comments? Did you learn anything new? Who got fired? Why did he get fired? Insubordination, what is that? Do you agree he should have got fired?
Yes.
Was he a great general?
Yes.
Why would we fire a successful general? Wait, what's more important? Respecting your authority or saving people's lives? Whoa. Scott says respecting authority. I kind of like that answer. Well, wait, he might have a reason, because he might say that if we get into a culture of not respecting authority, it leads to more lives being dead. Am I right? Is that possible?
Doing so well, bro.
Scott, so. Great job, Scott. You got all the answers today.
Okay, that brings us to the next item that happened during the Truman presidency, and that has to do with something we call the Red Scare. This isn't in your notes, but I put it up here on the board as things you should know that were happening in the 50s, and we'll cover it a little more when we get to the next administration. But there was this thing called a Red Scare that goes right along with the Cold War. Red is the color of what kind of government? Communist, right? So in America, it wasn't just like, hey, the governments are fighting. There was a real fear of communists and their ideas taking over our country. So Americans and their elected officials and Congress started holding committees and bringing people before the committee and questioning them. Are you now, or have you ever been associated with the Communist Party? And then they would ask you more questions to really find out if you weren't a part of the Communist Party, did you support in any way the Communist Party? They would ask you all kinds of questions. And guess what? If you went before that committee and there were the people were watching, it was put on TV, because now TV's starting to get into homes. And by the way, that's another thing that's happening right about this time, is television is just now becoming like part of people's homes. So if it's found out that you are any part of sympathizing with communists, that could ruin your political career. It could ruin your education career. It could ruin your entertainment career. Think about how far we've come or gone down in the last 70 years, where 70 years ago, when America knew firsthand the evil of communist government and how we had to defeat it, to here we are a couple generations later, and we're kind of like really kind of laid back about it, like it's not that big a deal. And it's almost like in the entertainment industry, if you speak greatly of communism, you get praised for it. If you were in the entertainment industry in the 1950s and they thought that you were part of a communist sympathizer, you're out. You'd be put on a blacklist. You're not getting any jobs anywhere in Hollywood. You're not getting a job anywhere in a prestigious university. You're not getting a job basically anywhere of any influence and importance in America, because the reality of it was so real and so fresh. See what I'm saying? You guys are growing up in a culture where we're so devoid of, everything's so comfortable that we don't realize the reality of it and what would happen if communism took over. So these people were really serious, and they get a bad rap now. So in history, these are the bad guys because they went too far. Did they? Probably. Right? I've been telling you all through study of history. A lot of people like to think it like this. It's either black or white, right or wrong, good or bad. No, there's a whole lot in between. These people, their motivation was, We absolutely have to keep communism out of our culture. Just like the devil, you give him a foothold, forget it, game over. Right? You give him an inch, he'll take a mile. We were so afraid of the encroachment of communism throughout the world and in our culture that we allowed, as people, our Congress, to bring these people and interrogate them. And if we found out that they were in slightest way involved in communism, their careers were ruined. But then there were other people that we brought there and they weren't. But they had witnesses against them, and then their career was ruined. And in America, is it okay to ruin someone's life and career because they have a different idea? Right? See, that's what we're up against. Is this a real thing? Yeah. So the House on Un-American Activity Committee becomes a big thing and a big buzzword at that time, and what do you call that? It's an issue that very divisive, polarizing. I just lost the word, but a polarizing issue. Did the committee go too far in trying to weed out all these communists? And because you were associated in any ways, I mean, your whole life should be ruined. Is that American? Right? So now we look back at this time, and the overwhelming consensus is this was a really bad thing. Kind of like we didn't talk about it much in World War II, but there was so much that we could have done in World War II. But you learned about it a little bit in fifth grade. What we did with recent, I think I talked about it, I don't know if it was in the notes, what we did with recent Japanese immigrants. And because the war was started by Japan, America was maybe rightly concerned that there would be people that would be favoring Japan. What would that mean for the whole west coast of America if our security was breached because you've got people that just left Japan, they've got maybe their children living in Japan, whose side are they going to be on? So there was legitimate concern. But then did we have to put them in internment camps? There's a big difference between concentration camps and internment camps. We put them so that we can have surveillance over them to make sure that they were not communicating with anyone that might go against America. But do we have to do that? So this is a big thing. And out of that comes these people. The italics for Rosenberg. That's a very famous name associated with the Red Scare, the beginning of the Cold War. Julius and Ethel were accused of communist spies. Think about it. In America, put them to death for treason. Kind of hard to think we would do that today, isn't it?
Not what I was saying.
Oh my God.